If you look at a map showing where any species lives, could be a plant, an animal, anything, those lines eventually just stop. There's a border. Ecologists call it the geographic range edge. And, well, the big question has always been, why there? Why doesn't the species just keep spreading? So today we're doing a deep dive into the evolutionary gears turning or maybe grinding to a halt right at these edges. Our guide is a really important review from 2020. It's called What Do We Really Know About Adaptation at Range Edges by Amy Angert, Megan Bontrager, and John Ågren.
Yeah, this is fundamental stuff. I mean, understanding range limits is core to biogeography, ecology, evolution, and hugely relevant for conservation today. But the authors really zero in on this fascinating puzzle. We see species adapting locally all the time inside their main range. They get tuned to their specific spot. Yet right at the edge, where you'd think adaptation would be crucial because conditions are tough, it often seems to just fail. The species hits a kind of evolutionary wall. It can't seem to adapt beyond its current niche. The review actually calls this the evolutionary enigma. Why does adaptation break down right where it's needed most?
Okay, let's get into that enigma. The review pulled together tons of theory, tons of empirical studies, looking at the four main forces of evolution. And what they found, which is really the key takeaway here, is that not all edges are the same. Just being at the edge of the map doesn't mean you're at the evolutionary edge. It's a crucial distinction.
Absolutely key. To even start, you've got to separate the different kinds of edges. The authors lay out two main types. First, you have equilibrial edges. Think of these as stable. They're stuck. The species has basically filled up all the suitable space right up to a hard environmental limit, and it just can't evolve the traits needed to survive beyond that line. Adaptation has genuinely failed there.
Right, the hard wall. And the second type.
Those are non-equilibrial edges. These are different. They're temporary, moving fronts. The environment beyond the edge might actually be perfectly fine, suitable even. But the species isn't there yet, maybe because it hasn't dispersed fast enough or its population hasn't grown quickly enough to push forward. It's limited by time, basically.
Okay, so transient edges.
Exactly. And those can be broken down further. You have leading edges. These are the pioneers, the population spreading into new, suitable areas. Their range hasn't caught up to their potential niche yet. And then you have trailing edges. These are populations pulling back, contracting, usually because the environment they were in has become unsuitable. Often, this is where we see tests of what's called evolutionary rescue. Can they adapt fast enough to hang on?
And this distinction is so relevant right now, isn't it? With climate change happening so fast. It's pushing species out of those stable equilibrial states and creating lots of new leading and trailing edges. Disequilibrium is becoming the norm.
Precisely. It makes understanding these dynamics, especially at leading edges, absolutely critical if we want to predict how life on Earth is going to respond, how species might track changing climates.
Okay, so let's walk through the evolutionary forces, starting with selection. What happens at those moving fronts, the leading edges, during spread?
Well, during that spread phase, both the theory and quite a lot of evidence line up pretty well. Selection strongly favors traits that help the species move fast and reproduce quickly. So things like better dispersal ability, maybe shorter generation times, higher numbers of offspring. In plants, sometimes even losing self-incompatibility, so a single individual can start a new population. These live, fast, travel far traits tend to become more common right at the front. They're essentially built for speed.
Built for speed,
Yeah.
okay. But does it work? Does it let them conquer new territory indefinitely?
Well, that's the catch. Even when selection does successfully push these traits, making them better dispersers or faster reproducers, we often see that overall fitness, survival and reproduction combined, actually declines right at the edge and beyond. So that adaptation for speed, it's often not enough. It doesn't guarantee they'll thrive in the new places. Speed isn't the same as being well adapted overall.
Okay, so that's selection during spread. What about at those stable equilibrial edges, the ones hitting that hard environmental wall?
Right, the niche-limited edges. Here, the idea is that selection should be really strong, and it should be directional. The population is poorly adapted to the conditions right at or beyond the edge, so selection is constantly pushing it towards a different set of traits needed to survive there. The agents of selection can be anything, really abiotic factors like temperature, or water availability, or biotic things like pollinators disappearing, or new competitors showing up.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? The review gives a great example. I think it was Clarkia xanthiana, that plant.
Yeah, that's a classic example. In the core of its range, where it's maybe wetter, selection might favor things like larger flowers to attract more pollinators or flowering later in the season, standard stuff for a good environment. But you go just beyond the range edge into drier territory, and the selective pressures totally flip. Suddenly, selection favors earlier flowering to beat the drought, maybe smaller flowers because resources are tight. The environment is demanding a completely different kind of plant.
So selection is strong, it's pointing in a new direction, but the population still doesn't cross the line. Why not? If selection is pushing, what's holding them back?
Well, this is where the other forces come in, acting as limits. The paper digs into the second and third forces, genetic drift and genetic constraints. This is about the raw material for adaptation, or the lack of it.
Okay, drift. That's the random change in gene frequencies,
Yeah.
right? More powerful in small populations.
Exactly. And populations at the edge are often smaller, more fragmented, maybe founded by just a few individuals.
Yeah.
So drift is predicted to be much stronger there. One major consequence of this increased drift, especially during range expansion, is something called genetic load.
Genetic load. That's carrying extra weight.
Sort of, yeah. Think of it as an accumulation of slightly harmful mutations. In a large, stable population, selection would weed these out. But at a small, rapidly expanding edge, these mutations can kind of surf to high frequency just by chance. There aren't enough individuals or enough strong selection against them initially to stop them spreading with the pioneers. This is sometimes called expansion load.
And does this load actually matter? Does it impact the plants or animals?
Oh, significantly. The synthesis by Bontrager and colleagues, which fed into this review, showed this really clearly. They looked at experiments where they grew plants from edge populations and core populations together in different places. On average, populations taken from both high-latitude and low-latitude geographic range edges just performed worse than central populations. Lower survival, fewer offspring. They seem intrinsically less fit, likely due to this accumulated load.
You can see this in their genes, too.
Yes, genomic studies are backing this up. They're finding evidence for more accumulated deleterious mutations in edge populations in various species, humans during our own expansions, tortoises, certain trees like Populus tracheocarpa. It suggests this genetic baggage is a real drag on adaptation at the edge.
So a lack of genetic quality can be a major roadblock. But are there ways around these genetic limits?
There are. The review points out that sometimes these constraints can be overcome. One way is through hybridization. Sometimes borrowing genes from a related species through what's called adaptive introgression can provide the exact adaptation needed to jump that environmental hurdle. The classic example is the Anopheles gambia mosquito in Africa. It picked up an insecticide resistance gene, and probably genes for drier conditions from a related species, which apparently allowed it to expand out of forests into drier savannas.
Wow, okay. So hybridization can break the deadlock. What about other genetic constraints, like traits being linked together?
Right, multivariate constraints. This is the idea that maybe you need to change two traits at once, but they're genetically linked so that improving one makes the other worse. A trade-off. For example, maybe genes that boost defense against herbivores also make the plant less tolerant to drought. If the edge environment demands both, the plant is stuck.
Does the evidence support this being a common problem?
It's mixed, actually. Some studies do find evidence for these kinds of trade-offs limiting adaptation at the edge, like in Bontrager stricta. But other studies, for instance in Arabidopsis lyrata, found that the genetic correlations, the gene matrix, didn't seem more restrictive at the edge. Sometimes it was even less constrained, more spherical. So while a lack of overall genetic variation or that genetic load seems like a pretty common issue, it's less clear that these complex genetic trade-offs are a universal barrier.
Okay, that covers drift and constraints. Let's move to the fourth force, gene flow. This one sounds complicated.
It really is. The authors describe it as a potential double-edged sword. Gene flow migration of individuals or their genes between populations can be helpful or can be really harmful, especially for edge populations.
What's the harmful side?
The big risk is maladaptive gene swamping. Imagine you have a small population at the edge that's just starting to adapt to the unique conditions there. If it's constantly receiving a flood of migrants carrying genes adapted to the core environment where the population is usually much larger, those core genes can overwhelm the locally adapted ones. Any progress the edge population made towards specializing gets washed away.
But hang on, earlier we said edge populations might be suffering from low genetic variation and high genetic load. Wouldn't any new genes coming in be good news? Help them out.
Ugh, that's the tension. It really depends on where those genes are coming from and what adaptations they carry. The review highlights some cool experimental work here. Studies in plants like Mimulus laciniatus and Clarkia pulchella did find that gene flow could be maladaptive. If you brought in genes from a population adapted to a very different environment, say different flowering time cues, it messed things up and reduced fitness at the edge. Phenologically mismatched, basically.
Okay, so swamping is real, but the helpful side.
Yes, the same studies often found a benefit too. If gene flow came from another population that was also experiencing similar challenging conditions, maybe an independent edge population, or even from a site that used to be like the current edge environment, then gene flow often improved fitness. It could bring in pre-adapted alleles that were missing, or it could help mask those deleterious recessive alleles contributing to genetic load. So it relieved load or provided needed variation.
So gene flow isn't just about quantity, it's about the quality and source of the genes.
Yep.
Very nuanced.
Extremely nuanced, not a simple good or bad thing.
Okay, we've covered the four forces. Selection, drift, constraints, gene flow. Let's synthesize this. Putting it all together, what does the review conclude about why adaptation fails at the edge? What's the big picture answer to the enigma?
This is probably the most important contribution of the paper. They argue really strongly that we have to stop lumping all range edges together. They are not all created equal. And the absolutely critical finding is that there's often a major disconnect between a population's geographic position on the map and its climatic or environmental marginality.
Explain that a bit more. Geographic edge versus climatic edge.
Right. You could be at the northernmost point where a species is found its high latitude geographic edge. But maybe due to ocean currents or mountains or something, that northern spot isn't actually the coldest place the species experiences across its entire range. Maybe some high altitude population further south is actually living in a much harsher, colder climate.
Ah, I see. So the edge on the map isn't always the edge environmentally.
Exactly. And the synthesis showed this has profound consequences for adaptation. Let's contrast the two types based on their findings, particularly from that Bontrager synthesis in Figure 1. Populations from high-latitude geographic edges, the ones at the map limit, tend to show a weaker local advantage. When tested against populations from elsewhere, they aren't dramatically better in their home site.
Why would that be?
Likely because of those historical spread dynamics we talked about. These geographic edges might be areas still influenced by past expansion, carrying that legacy of genetic load, or maybe they just haven't had enough time or consistent selection to fully specialize yet. Adaptation is lagging, or burdened by load.
Okay, so geographic edges might be genetically compromised. What about the climatic edges?
Now contrast that with populations from thermally marginal sites, places that are genuinely at the hot or cold climatic extreme for the species, regardless of where they sit geographically. These populations, the ones from the climatic edges, showed a significantly greater local advantage. They performed much better in their harsh home environment compared to populations brought in from elsewhere, suggesting that strong, consistent selection in those truly harsh climatic niches has driven powerful local adaptation and specialization. They are finely tuned to their extreme environment.
Wow. Okay, so that really flips the script. The key isn't just where you are on the map, but what the environment is like there. Local adaptation seems strongest where selection is most demanding at the climatic edges. But at geographic edges that aren't climatically extreme, the history of movement and drift, especially genetic load, seems to put the brakes on adaptation.
That's the core message. The legacies of spatial spread, like expansion load, can really hinder adaptation, especially when the geographic edge and the climatic edge don't line up.
What does this mean for, say, conservation? It sounds like it changes how we should think about protecting biodiversity.
It really does. A major implication is that using geographic position, like protecting the northernmost population, as a simple proxy for identifying uniquely adapted populations might be misguided. If we want to conserve the populations that have evolved unique adaptations to environmental extremes, the paper strongly suggests we need to use environmental data, climate data, soil data, or whatever is relevant, to pinpoint those climatically marginal sites directly. Those are likely where the most distinct evolutionary potential lies.
That makes a lot of sense. Identify the populations truly living on the environmental edge. And I'm still thinking about that genetic load idea, the paradox you mentioned. Species spreading fastest might be accumulating the most problems.
Yeah, it's a fascinating potential trade-off. The very process of rapid expansion could sow the seeds of future vulnerability by building up this genetic load at the leading edge. It could lead to these sort of stop-and-go range shifts. A species spreads rapidly, accumulates load, stalls out, maybe takes time to purge the load or wait for beneficial gene flow, and then potentially sprints again.
Which points towards maybe needing different conservation strategies for different kinds of edges.
Possibly. For those latitudinal geographic edges where high genetic load seems common, simply protecting them in isolation might not be enough. The review suggests that maybe the best approach is preserving networks or sets of these edge populations, and potentially even considering managed interpopulation crossing what's called genetic rescue. Carefully mixing populations could mask those harmful recessive alleles causing the load, while hopefully still retaining the unique beneficial adaptations each population has. It's controversial, but the genetics point that way.
So looking forward, where does research need to go? The paper must have some recommendations.
Definitely. A big one is moving beyond simple core versus edge comparisons. We need more studies, especially transplant experiments, that look at adaptation across continuous environmental gradients, mapping traits and fitness along the whole gradient, not just comparing the extremes. And perhaps most importantly, the field needs to stop thinking so much in terms of a strict dichotomy between equilibrial, stable, and disequilibrial shifting ranges. Given climate change, disequilibrium is pervasive. The real question now is understanding how these ongoing dynamics of spread, contraction, and load accumulation interact with the process of adaptation to new conditions. How do they help or hinder species persistence?
Right, disequilibrium isn't the exception anymore, it's becoming the rule.
It's the new normal, which leads to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. If rapid climate change means constant movement and shifting ranges are here to stay, how will this complex dance play out? The dance between expansion dynamics, which can create genetic load, and the intense selection for specialization needed at new climatic extremes. Which species will manage that balance and keep pace? And which might falter?
A huge and critical question for the future of biodiversity. It really highlights how dynamic evolution is at these boundaries. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into what we know and perhaps what we thought we knew about range edges. Thank you for joining us.